All right, folks, welcome to Traffic Pattern Operations. Now, this is one of a million videos that are out there regarding traffic pattern operations. So why would I make another one? Because what I'm going to do is share with you my techniques, what I think about, where my eyes go, what my hands are doing, what I'm saying to myself, what checklists I'm running, what sight pictures I'm looking for, all of which are very similar, but maybe not exactly identical to other techniques out there. So hopefully, in your ground school, and as you watch various videos and fly with different instructors, you'll get all these different techniques and inputs and sight pictures, and then you'll figure out among all those which of those really work for you, which one of those can you really connect with, and then you'll build your own arsenal or your quiver of arrows or whatever you want to call it, of techniques to use to fly the perfect pattern and, of course, the perfect touchdown. And there's a saying that the perfect landing starts with, obviously, a perfect traffic pattern. So that's what I'm going to do here is talk about what I think about, what I do, and how we're going to compensate for wins, the sight pictures we're looking for. And hopefully this will help you out. And the good news is that this is what I would teach you if we were chatting in person. And the good news is you can go back and, for free, go and look at this over and over and over again and hit pause and replay it, and then go look at another video that talks about something similar, and then merge the two to come up with your own technique and your own ability, or whatever, you know what I'm talking about, your own set of skills to go out and fly the perfect traffic pattern and therefore the perfect touchdown. All right. So with that being said, and you can see my pointer here, so I'll use that to kind of guide us around often throughout this briefing. I'm just recording a PowerPoint slideshow. That's all this is. So here we go. The example I'm going to use for this briefing is Meadow Lake Airfield. It's K-Fly, coincidentally, out in Falcon, Colorado, not too far from Colorado Springs. And its runway is 1533. And I'm going to act as if, by the way, I'm a little under the weather, so you'll hear me click pause now and then just to do a light cough. But we're going to act like today we're on 15. And obviously the reciprocal heading for that would be 13. So here we have a typical traffic pattern, and I have a yellow line depicting our turn to crosswind. Now, ideally, we would like to say, hey, we square these things off, and at lower altitudes you can because the aircraft performs better, but there's no way that you could square this off, because by the time you roll out to square it off, you're already approaching your downwind position. So typically at these higher elevations, like which we are at, you will have rounded corners here. So that's why I've got it depicted. And here's our 45 entry leg into the pattern. Now, why do we have to do a 45? Well, I'm going to talk about collision avoidance, line of sight rates, and how when we're on collision course with something, it doesn't move forward or back or up and down in our windscreen. It stays steady and only gets bigger. So we'll talk about that 45 here in a second. But first, I want to talk about my relationship to the airfield right now. Notice I am pointing right at the airfield, perpendicular, midway down. Now, our aeronautical information manual says that, yes, do that. This is how you ought to approach the airfield. But I will tell you, there's a reason why I do it slightly different. And look at our intercept point for our 45 if I'm aiming straight down the runway. It hits right here, and then I don't have very much time on that 45. And why do I want to be on the 45? To look for traffic. So the longer I'm on it, the better. I have more time to catch that aircraft that is in the pattern with no radio, right? I mean, that's feasible. Or maybe he's got a radio, but it's broke. We call that NORDO, meaning no radio. So my technique is to offset slightly towards the departure into the runway down here, not all the way to the end, but slightly offset, and intercept the 45 a little sooner, so I got some more time to drone. That drone is a term. It's not like the drones that you buy at the store and fly around with cameras. Drone means we're just driving. We're just driving straight ahead, straight and level. So I got more time to drone on this 45 and look over here for traffic. And we'll talk about techniques to do that here in a second. I've got this aircraft depicted, I mean, a mile and a half or so, maybe 2 miles from the airfield. But we want to get our checks done out there at 3 to 5, 7 miles done. Now, I may not drop flaps. I'm not going to drop gear. etc. But I'm already thinking before landing checklist to the point where when I roll out here, maybe there's one item left. So if my before landing checklist says carb heat on, turn the landing light on, and taxi light as well, if that's part of your checklist, then I can do that out here at 3 to 5 miles. I don't have to be right at base position. Now that doesn't mean, and I'm not going to touch the gear and flaps till I'm at base position. I'm certainly not lowering gear at 7 miles from the airfield. But the point is, I want you to start thinking about all your checklists while you're way out there away from the pattern. Because if you wait until you get into the pattern and come to find out there's 8 airplanes, half of them aren't saying what they're supposed to. Oh, here goes a guy just passing real close to me that didn't even make a radio call. All these little distractions will cause you to do what? Miss a checklist item. And that is how people get distracted and land gear up or roll out on final and can't figure out why they're sinking with a given power setting and airspeed and realize it's because they don't have the flaps down. Or somebody, you land, you taxi back, shut down. Somebody says, hey, dude, you did the whole pattern without your landing light on. Oh my gosh. So you know what I'm trying to tell you. Get as much stuff done out at range over here before you actually get into the pattern. When I am 5, 7, 8 miles away from the traffic pattern, I like to be slightly high just in case there's somebody else co-altitude with me at traffic pattern altitude. We won't collide as we're both veering towards that 45-degree entry point. But when I'm about 3 miles out, I want to be at traffic pattern altitude. And there's a reason for that. And that is any traffic in the traffic pattern that is at traffic pattern altitude, if I am also at traffic pattern altitude, where will they be relative to my horizon? They'll be right on it. Actually, they'll be slightly above the horizon, right? I always use fingers, holding out my hand horizontal. And I use fingers a lot of times when I instruct, when I talk about width, finger width, 2 finger, 3 finger, 4 finger. We do that a lot of times when we talk about pre-flight, right? Hey, landing gear strut, how much of the strut should be exposed? Well, nose gear is 3 fingers, main gear 4 fingers. So same thing. Well, at something out at range, if it's at the same altitude I am, it should be about 1 finger to 2 fingers above the horizon. But if I'm 200 and 300 feet or 200 to 300 feet high and something is at traffic pattern altitude, I'm 200 to 300 feet above traffic pattern altitude, where will that other airplane be? Oh, it's going to be down in the weeds, right? So now we got a dark airplane, painted dark or whatever, against some dark background, right? The forest, the trees, mountains, urban buildup. And it's going to make me picking up that aircraft much more difficult. Now, he'll find me a lot easier. Why? Because I'm up against this nice light blue background. But that's not the right answer. We both should be co-altitude so that I can, number one, that's where that's where I should be, right? I should be at track pattern altitude, but it helps me pick up the visual on anybody in the pattern much quicker. And it helps other people find me. Why? Because I am where they expect me to be. So if someone is on downwind, if they hear me make a 5-mile call, approaching 45 downwind for Meadow Lake, and they're on downwind at traffic pattern altitude, and they're looking over to find me, they're also going to be using the 2-finger or so technique above the horizon to try to find me. They're not going to be looking a fist above. They may eventually scan that high, but initially that's not where they're looking because they expect me to be at traffic pattern altitude. Meanwhile, I've already gotten the weather, right? At 10 miles out, 10, whatever your workload allows, we'd like to get it about 10 miles out, but I've gone to the local, for that airfield, ASOS or AWOS frequency, gotten the weather. And based on the winds, I can predict what the runway is going to be. Then I go to the local frequency, the common frequency for that airfield. And if I'm by myself, no one else is there, then I get to pick the active runway based on the winds. But if other people are already there beating up the pattern, well, guess what? Based on the winds, they've already picked the runway, and I'm just going to flow in with them. But whatever the case may be, I'm building a mental 3-dimensional picture of the traffic in the pattern. Who's there? How many people are there? Where are they at in the pattern? And I'm listening to their skill set. I hate to say that, and it's not that I'm judging. It's just if I hear somebody kind of making not so good radio calls, that tells me they're in a stage of learning, and that means I need to they're probably with an instructor, but I still need to kind of pay special attention to what they're doing. Like if they're ahead of me, that they're not turning base really early or really late, which is going to create cutoff on the final turn and things like that. So those are some things I'm listening to. And then I'll also throw down here that I am also setting up my instruments in the cockpit to help me maintain situational awareness relative to the runway. Now, I'm not talking about DME, distance measuring equipment. I'm not talking about calling up the localizer and centering the CDI. None of that stuff. I'm talking about just some basic instrument stuff, some settings I can put on my instruments so that I can know where I'm at relative to the runway in terms of heading. Let me give you an example. Here at Meadow Lake, you see these hangars and these buildings and facilities? Those are white. They really are in this Google Earth picture, and they stand out. Notice everything else is dark. Even all these houses and everything else is dark, relatively speaking. So you can see Meadow Lake Airfield proper from 10, 15 miles away. I've picked it up, especially if you're a little bit higher, way out there. But I can't see the runway. There's no way you're going to see the runway. And by the way, look at this grass strip. What if Meadow Lake was a grass strip only? When do you think you're ever going to see that runway? Man, maybe not even until you're kind of on downwind, assuming it's springtime, everything's green and all that. The point is, I could see the airfield and I'm flying right at it, but am I flying at it perpendicular to the runway? That's what's in question. So let me show you a quick video. I'm going to record something else here and throw it in the middle of this video and show you how I set up my HSI and gyro compass, or just gyro compass if that's all I've got, to maintain some situational awareness on my heading relative to the runway so that I can hit this thing exactly 90 degrees out. So we'll go to that and then I'll come right back. All right, gang, I wanted to create this small little, video snippet to insert into the main video and talk about a technique that came to mind after the fact. And when I talk about entering the pattern, and this is a technique I use all the time, very, very frequently I use it. And it's one that helps me maintain situational awareness relative to the direction that the runway is going. So, for example, Meadow Lake is the example that we're going to use throughout the instructional video. So they are runway 1533. So this helps me maintain SA, situational awareness, on where my nose is pointed, i.e. my heading, relative to the extended center line of the runway. Now, I say all this reminding you that our primary reference is the runway outside. But remember, if we're 4, 5, 6, 7 miles away, approaching the traffic pattern, you may not even see the runway. You may see the airport proper, meaning the hangars and some of the buildings and maybe a major intersection near there. And sometimes there's water tanks, the flat type, painted white or whatever. You may be able to go, yeah, the airfield's over there, but you can't always tell exactly how you are oriented to the runway. So this is a technique that I use very often. So once you've gone over and talked to ATIS and now know the active runway, you could do what I'm about to show you here. Or if you're going to an uncontrolled airfield that doesn't have ATIS and you listen to the weather on ASOS or AWOS there, and you'd make your own determination on what runway you want to make the active runway based on winds. Or if you go to the common air traffic freak for that airfield and find that people are already there beating up the pattern and they've already established that the runway at Meadow Lake's 15, then you can do this. So you don't want to do this entering the 45 downwind leg, because you don't want to be heads down. You need to be looking out outside. And as you get more and more proficient in the airplane, you can now do this closer and closer and closer to the airfield as your task saturation levels allow. So this is a technique I'm going to show you. So currently we're headed in a westerly direction, kind of like we were in that picture I showed you at the beginning of the video. But let's see how we are oriented in relation to the way that the runway is oriented. So if we look at our HSI, and you may not have an HSI in your aircraft, you may just have a gyro compass or a compass rose, something like that. But if you look here, we know for our demonstration purposes that the active runway is 15. So if you picture that runway on this HSI, it extends from 15 to 33 and vice versa, 33 to 15. So let's take our course arrow, and this thing misbehaves all the time. Oh, there we go. She's moving. Of course, I went the long way around, but to get it to go back the other way, you're taking chances making this thing do what you want. Boom. So we've got 150, more specifically 15 dialed into the HSI. And now this HSI, forget the CDI down here, it's going to be all over the place back and forth. But now this line right here from the arrow to the tail of the course arrow represents my runway. And we know this is our heading. So what can you tell me about our heading relative to the runway? They're not perpendicular, are they? So if I look out in front of me and say, yep, I'm pointed right at the airfield, but am I perpendicular to the runway? Well, you can look at this and know that the answer is no. So we now know that 90 degrees out from the runway heading is over here at 2-4. So we're just going to do an easy left-hand turn here to get over to a 2-4 heading. So we got a turn going here to hit. And again, I don't want to fight with this simulator, but we're going to go about perpendicular now to the runway. Perpendicular to the runway. Now, suppose that we didn't have an HSI. I'm going to put in just a little bit more turn here because I want to take ourselves out of perpendicular to the runway. And suppose we didn't have an HSI, and just simply suppose we had our gyro compass down here. So with our gyro compass down here, we can do something fairly similar, right? So we know the runway is 1533. So imagine a line cutting across our gyro compass right here. And you can tell already, without even doing anything with the heading bug, that we are not perpendicular to the runway. Now, we may be flying right at it, but we're not perpendicular to the runway, which means we're not setting ourselves up for a good entry into that pattern. So we could take our, well, first of all, if you don't have a heading bug, and I've been in many airplanes that don't, just picture the line going from 15 to 33, and we need to turn our aircraft such that we have, and again, this thing, there we go. Turn our aircraft so that we are perpendicular to our imaginary runway running. Now, it's not perfect right now, but again, to get perfection from the simulator is asking us to split the Red Sea. So, but we're definitely better than it was before. Maybe I can tweak it a little bit, because, we're always striving for perfection as aviators. There we go. So now I know, even without a heading bug, if I didn't have one in the airplane, and without an HSI, I now know that I am perpendicular to the airfield as I'm flying this 240 heading. And of course, if you do have a heading bug, you can just take the thing and turn it such that it's on the runway. And now I know that I'm perpendicular to the runway. And we can use this picture now that also to QC, quality control, quality check, do whatever term you want to use, to evaluate how we are doing when we are in the pattern. Right, so when we're turning crosswind, are we actually 90 degrees to the runway? When we're turning downwind, are we actually parallel to the runway now? Now, again, all this is, I say all this knowing full well that our primary reference is what? Looking out the runway. But I can tell you, I can look out at the runway, and I can't tell if I'm 2 to 3 degrees off in terms of paralleling the runway or not, so I can come inside here and double check that. The other thing is, too, I can look out at the runway and go, yep, but I know my winds are blowing me from the right, so maybe I want to crab into the wind just a little bit more. Maybe I want to take my heading from exactly 3-3 and maybe take it to 3-4 or 3-4-5 to compensate, and then see how that works for me. And then I'm going to nail 3-4-5 every time after that, assuming that 3-4-5 works well. So this is a good technique that you can use for using your instruments to align yourself perpendicular with the runway while you're still 3 to 5, 7 miles out, and you can't even see the runway. You see the airfield, but you can't see the runway itself. And so now you can orientate yourself to that runway. All right, so there you go. That's how I set up my instruments relative to, the airfield, etc. in here. Based on that other little video snippet you just saw. And by the way, I filmed it or made it several hours ago. So if there's something I said in there that I repeat here, my apologies. But I don't make these things usually, these snippets and chunks and these different pieces. I don't make them back to back. Rarely do I do. I make them at different times, etc. And then I pull them all together to make one comprehensive video. Let's talk about real quick our traffic pattern altitude. Where did we get that? How did we pick 7,900 feet? Well, we go there all the time, and that's what my instructor told me. Yeah, but what if you're cross country and you got to divert to another airfield, fly traffic pattern, land full stop, and get gas? What's the traffic pattern altitude? Well, our Aeronautical Information Manual, our AIM for short, tells us we should pick a traffic pattern altitude that's 1,000 feet AGL above the airfield, right? If we go to our chart supplement for wherever you're flying at, and we're in Colorado for the purposes of this brief. So I go to my chart supplement, I look up Meadow Lake, and guess what? If there's nothing published here, then we use 1,000 feet AGL. So I can go to my field elevation of 6878, and in my simple walnut-sized brain, that's 6,900. I'm going to add 1,000 feet to it, and that's where I got the 7,900 feet for traffic pattern altitude. Here's an example of an airfield where they don't want you to pick 1,000. They're going to tell you, by golly, what they want the traffic pattern altitude to be. And here they were very specific. They said 7270. And again, in my walnut-sized brain, that's 7,300 on the clock. By the way, when you hear the term on the clock, that means your altimeter. Just on the clock is a nickname that's used for that, if you haven't heard that before. So not only do they dictate what the traffic, that's TPA, by the way, not only do they dictate what the traffic pattern altitude is at 7270, but they also tell you what that is AGL above the ground. So here they've published it, they've gotten specific, and they are being directive, 800 feet AGL, but here they just leave it alone. And so by default, it becomes the 1,000-foot AGL, like we are told to do in the Aeronautical Information Manual. And of course, I pulled out of paragraph 433 and 4331 what the reference is here in your chart. I'm sorry, in your Aeronautical Information Manual. Right here. Hey, while we're here, let me talk about something else real quick. By the way, the B means beacon. They've got a beacon at this airfield here at Meadow Lake. Notice they don't want to have one here. And you'll have all your runway information, etc. And of course, this is a course on chart supplement reading and terminology. But I do want to highlight the following. Back to this slide, this is a left-hand traffic pattern that we're going to fly here at Meadow Lake. We're going to enter at a 45, go to downwind, hit our base position, and start a left-hand turn. So it's a left-hand traffic pattern. How did we know that? Well, your chart supplement for all your airfields will tell you. Now, notice for these runways here at Crawford, it doesn't say left, right, or anything except right here. So, but what about runway 07? It doesn't say left or right, so what do we use? Well, it says nothing, and that means we default to left-hand traffic pattern. So, if you're going to go to a place that you haven't been before, or you've been there occasionally and can't remember what the traffic pattern direction is, go to your chart supplement, and if you do not see anything there specific, then it is a left-hand traffic pattern. Now, I will be honest with you, and this has even happened in discussions with other pilots, and I was embarrassed, but I said something like, yeah, default traffic pattern is always to the right, and the guy goes, no, dude, it's always to the left. And I was like, that's right. Well, how can we remember if it's default left or default right? Well, a couple things. One, very rarely do you ever see, if any time at all that I'm aware of, will you ever see left traffic pattern written anywhere in the chart supplement. Why? Because it's default left. That's one way to remember. The other way is this. We have a cockpit, flight deck, whatever politically correct term we're using today. And how many people does it sit? Well, normally 2. Who sits on the left? Normally it's the pilot, right? So what's his primary ground reference when flying in the traffic pattern? It's the runway. So is it easier to see out the left window when you're sitting in the left seat and keep an eye on the runway and fly relative to it? Or is it easier as you're in the left seat to look out the right window and maintain situational awareness and your spacing and everything else off the runway? Of course not. It's always easier on the left. So when I make my left turn, my left base turn, I want the runway right there. I can look right out over my shoulder. But looking out the right would not be, if we were doing a right base and I'm in the left seat, right base turn in the left seat, which you have to do sometimes, but it's not the easiest. So the default answer ought to always be the easiest answer. And that's another way to remember. So that's kind of a little side note right there. And I'll touch on that one more time real quickly here in a second. So here we are. We're offset slightly to the south in our example towards the departure end of runway 15. And we've talked about how we're going to set up our instruments. We've talked about this. And then I'm asking myself, how are the winds going to affect my pattern? How are the winds going to affect my pattern? We'll talk about that here in a second, specifically how the winds do affect our pattern. But the reason why I'm asking, remember, and by the way, we're not even close to downwind, but I'm already thinking about how the winds are going to affect my downwind. And this is a great example of a concept that you need to be completely understanding of throughout your entire aviation career. And whether you just stay a private pilot or you're just flying for for recreational purposes, or if you want to go on in and get your ATP, fly for the airlines, whatever, you're always staying ahead of the airplane, at least 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 minutes, 10 minutes ahead of the airplane, always thinking about what do I need to be doing? What's next? What's the next checklist? Do I have it out on that page? Do I have my radios dialed into the frequency that I know they're going to push me to? All of that kind of stuff you should be ahead of the game on. So that's an example here. That's what we're doing. We're asking ourselves, even before we've turned our 45-degree entry leg, we're asking, how are the winds going to affect my pattern? And the other thing we're doing, which is probably one of the most important, if not the most important thing we're doing as we're approaching this 45 and flying this 45, is that we are going to look at the downwind position right here. I'm not looking right here. I mean, I may glance over there just for situational awareness, but the first place my eyes are going is here. Why is that? Because an aircraft here, some traffic right there, is a much higher threat. In fact, we could collide with it than anything over here. Anything over here, we're just going to fly behind it as it continues on to base. But this is the high threat area, and that's why I've got shaded red, and that's where my eyes are going. As I'm looking at my airspeed, as I'm looking at my altitude, I'm back outside looking for traffic, etc. So what I want to talk about real quick is, and it's a very important concept to understand as you look for traffic that potentially can run into you or you run into it. Why do we want to enter on a 45? Okay, suppose that we didn't have this thing called a 45. We just drive straight at the downwind and then rack up an 80-degree 9G turn and then roll right out. Well, the problem is this, and I will show you. These two aircraft are on a collision course, and the intercept angle between the two is 180 degrees. We call this 180 out. And the rate at which these two aircraft are closing is the combined speed of both aircraft. So a very, very high combined closure rate. That's what we call this. And so by the time they see each other, because of this rapid closure rate, they have very little time to react to avoid one another. Look at the example over here on the right side. By the way, I have no idea what this speaker thing is down here. I don't know. So look at our example here on the right. They are also on a collision course because they're at the same altitude, and their vectors, their flight vectors, are converging. That means they're going to join someplace up here in the future. But what's the difference between their closure here and their closure over here? Well, this is much, much slower. Much slower. We buy ourselves some time. So if I'm in this blue aircraft scanning over here for traffic, and he's in the red aircraft scanning over here for traffic, we get more time to find each other before we actually hit, because we've slowed this intercept down. We've slowed this collision down. We have decreased this collision, this convergent angle from 180 to 10 or 15, I don't know, whatever this is right here, but we've slowed it down. So now if I go back to this picture here, if we were to fly a 90-degree path right into downwind and then turn into downwind, that's a pretty rapid closure rate for some traffic that's right here. But if I stop and turn 45 and slow down the closure, I mean, I haven't slowed my airplane down. I'm still flying 100 miles an hour for my particular airplane. We fly the Warriors and the Cherokees predominantly, and they're all in miles per hour. So at 100 miles per hour, I haven't changed my airspeed, but the actual physical closure rate between a potential aircraft on downwind and me on 45, I have slowed that down. And here's another example. Here's me on 45, and here's an aircraft on downwind. And note, I've slowed our closure rate between us by having a 45-degree intercept rate, basically. And by the way, just a side note, this is the same concept that air-to-air missiles use when they're attacking aircraft. They keep this angle the same, and the angle between them and the target, so the angle between their longitudinal axis and the angle between that and where they're looking at the target with the seeker, they keep that constant, and they know they're on a collision course. So that leads to another discussion, okay, about this. If I am on a collision course, in fact, I may even draw, this thing will let me, yeah, okay, cool. If I am on a collision course with this red airplane right here, notice I drew, that's what's cool about doing PowerPoint, you can draw in real time. If I'm on a collision course with this red aircraft, that means the angle between my flight path and the angle between what's called the line of sight. So from my eyeballs to that aircraft, the angle here never changes. That's how you know you're on a collision course. And we call that CATA, C-A-T-A, collision antenna train angle. And it comes from the old radar intercept days. The point being is, since this angle never changes, that means this airplane never moves forward in my windscreen. So for example, if I'm looking out here at this airplane and he's, right over my, where my hand, my wrist is, my fist is on the controls, he's going to remain over my fist the entire time up until collision. But if we're not on a collision course, he will drift forward of my fist or back of my fist. If he drifts forward in my windscreen, in other words, he's moving forward, we call that forward line of sight. And that means I will fly to a position behind him. In other words, he will be out in front of me. If he's drifting aft on my windscreen, in other words, moving backwards, in other words, behind my wrist more and more and more, that means we're going to flow out in front of him when we get to downwind. And, this concept we use all the time. We just don't realize it. I could come up with a crazy example, and I'm sure there's more real world examples out there. But just suppose that I was stupid and I want to drive my car across a train track, and here comes a train. And let's just say there's none of those arms that come down, right? So I'm racing down the highway. I see a train. Maybe my wife's in the car with me and she's about to give birth. I don't know. You make up whatever dumb scenario you want. But I look out and I see the train coming, and I got to ask myself very quickly, am I going to make it? Well, how do I know if I'm going to make it? Well, if the very front of the train never moves forward or backwards on my windshield, relative to all the stuff, maybe it's right above the volume knob of my radio, the train, then I know that I am going to collide with the front of that train. But if the train is moving forward in other words, moving closer and closer and closer to out in front of me, then that train's going to get to that intersection before I will. But if the train is drifting aft, so it's over the volume knob, now it's over the tuning knob, now it's over the passenger vent, for the air conditioner, now it's over the passenger side mirror. In other words, it's drifting well aft, away from the front of my car, what we call the nose. If we were in an airplane, then I know I'm going to pass well in front of this train. I'm going to get to the intersection well before that train will. So same thing applies here. The point is, when we go back to this picture, what you're looking for is not something that's going to easily be seen. Something that you're not going to collide with will have some line of sight rate, either forward or back. But it's unfortunate that the highest threat object that you're on a collision course with does not move. That's interesting, isn't it? But it just gets bigger. So that whole discussion is to emphasize how important it is that your cross-check is outside, looking for the target that is not moving, just a finger or two above the horizon, and it will only get bigger. And that's why it's important. Imagine this isn't you, but rather you are in the traffic pattern. That is how important these radio calls are. By the way, I didn't mention this instructional video is not going to contain any traffic pattern radio calls. We're going to do a separate video on that. This is just about where our eyes, our hands are going, what our mouth is saying to ourselves in the cockpit, what checklists we're running, and the sight pictures that we're going to see as we're flying around executing traffic pattern operations. So I beat this horse to death, but I just wanted to emphasize the importance of this phase of traffic pattern entry and why these concepts here are very important. Okay? Awesome. So here we are. Now we're on 45 flying in. I'm still looking at the high threat area. Maybe doing a few more items on my before landing checklist. Still listening up on the radio, figuring out where people are, what are the high threat areas. But I'm still entering that 45 right there. And now I'm going back to that question, how are the winds going to affect my pattern? And we'll talk about some stuff here specific, because if there's no wind or a slight tailwind from the south in this example, I may roll out on the perfect downwind ground track. Meadow Lake specific, for those of you watching this, when you are on downwind. It's a big R store. It's a country store that, tractor parts and all that. Big white roof. I have found, the way I fly my base pattern, that a really ideal no wind traffic pattern, ground track, puts you right over that building. And what else is cool, if you look down on it, as you approach it, it's got a big American flag in the parking lot, and that gives you an idea what the winds are doing at the surface, because what the winds are doing here are always different than what the wind sock is showing at the airfield, because of all these hangars, especially when the wind's from the east. Anyway, a little side note there. But I'm asking myself, how are the winds going to affect my pattern? Because I may not want to roll out on this perfect downwind ground track if the winds are blowing from the east over here or from the west. If they're tailwind or headwind, it shouldn't be a headwind, right? Because then we should be landing on the other runway. By the way, I didn't mention this when we talk about runway. When you look at Meadow Lake, because we fly at Meadow Lake, notice they dictate right-hand traffic for runway 33. So that means if we're on runway 33, in other words, landing to the north, it's a right-hand traffic pattern instead of a left. And why is that? Because you got the gliders here on this strip. So your chart supplement, I didn't mean to backtrack, I'm sorry, but your chart supplement will get very specific for the traffic pattern direction. As I looked at this grass strip just a second ago, I realized I didn't mention that. So back to our question here, how are the winds going to affect my pattern? So let's look at this. If we on the far left side here, if we got a calm wind / tailwind, man, our ground track is going to be right down the middle, right down the planned normal ground track. And remember, our primary reference when we're flying in the traffic pattern is what? The runway. But if there's some things on the ground here that I can fly over or point at that I have found work for me and that they're the proper distance for no wind or wind, then I'll use those references on the ground. But I always have to remember that the primary reference is the runway, and I'm going to show you how we use that to depict, or rather to set, a good downwind position. If the winds are blowing me away from the runway, in this example, they're coming from the west over here, so I may want to offset my downwind ground track towards the runway. And I'll show you why here in terms of turn radius, etc. And of course, we'll be crabbing into the wind. So if my perfect reciprocal heading, no wind reciprocal heading, was 3-3, well, here I maybe want to fly 3-1-0 if the winds are really strong. And then conversely speaking, if the winds are from the east, I want to set my downwind ground track into the wind. In other words, a slightly wider pattern, because the winds are going to push me past extended center line when I turn base. And just like we crabbed over here and set a different heading other than just the plain old 3-3-0 reciprocal, we may want to go 3-4-0, 3-5-0, depends on the magnitude of the winds. So the time to do this, to make this decision on what ground track and crab or / heading you want to have, is not when we hit here and then fly for, a quarter of a mile and then decide we need to correct for winds. Make that decision way out here when we're asking ourselves about the winds. So we can tell ourselves, yep, there's the big white building for downwind, but the winds are coming from the east, so I'm going to turn early and point my nose somewhere east of the big white building to account for the winds coming from the east. That's an example. So we don't want to make that decision late. Let's make it right here when we make this turn. So here's a normal downwind picture, no wind. Most airplanes, this is low-wing airplanes, this is what you're going to see. About a mile from the runway is a good position, and most low-wing airplanes, from the left seat, when you look out, you're going to put that runway about a quarter of the way down the wing. Now, if you go out and set this sight picture and everything is perfect, no winds, you fly the perfect pattern, you find that you end up undershooting. In other words, you get all the way through the 180-degree final turn and you're not lined up on final. You actually have to check back a little bit to the right, then reset this picture. But this is just a going out the door picture. Every pilot flies their base position a little different. Every wing and every airplane is a little different. And there's almost always never zero wind up at altitude, right? But this is just a good picture, sight picture you can hang your hat on. And this is a good reference where I talked about earlier that the runway is always our primary reference. Our primary reference is always the runway. And then this is our normal sight picture, looking at the left side, normal seating height, right? Because if you sit lower, this will look different. You sit higher, this will look different. For someone, if you're an instructor, happen to be watching this, and you're giving instruction, what you see out the left side may not be the same what a student of a different height, like young kids can go work on their PPL. And you may have someone that's much, much taller looking out the left side. So again, this sight picture may be different. And of course, this is the no wind sight picture. Now here's the winds pushing us into the runway. In other words, we're looking at this example right here where we're crabbing, right? Our ground track is still heading 330, but we've offset away from the runway, and now our heading is into the wind so that we fly a ground track that's parallel to the runway. And that's what this picture looks like. That's why the wingtip is angled into the wind. Notice also that we've moved ourselves further away from the runway, i.e. we put the runway on the wingtip instead of a quarter of a way down. So that's a good sight picture for the winds that are blowing you into the runway. We call those overshooting winds, and we'll talk about why here in a second. And then, of course, here's this picture, which is represented by this one right here. The winds are blowing us away from the runway. So we're going to have undershooting winds when we are turning base to final. So we fix that by getting closer to the runway. And you can go about halfway down the wing to set that runway position. And these are the winds pushing you away from the runway. Now before we get to this point right here, I want to show you a quick video that talks about setting up our avionics. So we've already talked about setting up the avionics entering the pattern. Then let's talk about how we can use them real quick on this downwind position right here. All right, another video snippet that I'm going to insert into the primary instructional video. So suppose now that this picture you see here, we set up at 3 to 5, 7 miles away from the airfield. Now we are about to hit that 45-degree entry line. So what is 45 degrees relative to our runway? Well, if we have an HSI and we put the runway into our course arrow right here, into our course, 45 degrees off is right here at what we call the 45-degree looper line or upper looper line. Upper looper line is here, 45 upper here, 45 upper. Here's your 90 degree, your 270, or you can call them both 90 degrees. 90 degree doesn't mean heading, it just means 90 degrees from here. Then you usually have a 180 looper line, but there's not one here, but that's okay because we can just use the reciprocal, right? But we know now a good 45-degree heading to enter this pattern is 280. So if we were to do a right-hand turn, and again, it's like betting on the lotto here to see if this thing works. Oh, there we go. What do you know? Of course, it's going to rack up 70 degrees of bank. There we go. So now we're turning to that heading that takes us 45 degrees. And again, it's, golly, it always takes its time rolling out. So let's come back a little bit to correct because I want you to see a good sight picture. So now, boom, right there. Let's do this. A little bit more. There we go. So now, all right, and I was wrong on the head. It's about 285. So now 150, 45 degrees. Well, look at that. We are now exactly heading 45 degrees relative to the runway right here. And that's what we wanted, right? That's the 45-degree entry that we want. Again, forget this CDI. Don't pay attention to where it's at, other than you can imagine it being a part of the runway. Imagine it being over here, and this whole yellow line, what we call a course arrow coupled with a CDI, is our runway. Now, suppose we didn't have an HSI, horizontal situation indicator. Suppose all we have is a gyro compass. Remember, if we have the heading bug, we can put the bug on our runway and just turn to put the tip of the runway, imaginary runway, at the 45-degree mark down here. Or you could, if we were heading 240 earlier, you could look over here and see what 90 degrees off, what that heading would have been, and you can just turn to a point in between. In this example, here's 240. Here's the tail end of the runway, and we just turn to a heading to be in between here and here. This is 90 degrees. 90 degrees divided by 2 is 45. So we know we're on a 45-degree heading. And then lastly, if we don't have a heading bug, and again, there's many aircraft out there that don't, we can just visualize the runway 1533 passing through right through here on our gyro compass. And remember earlier when we were perpendicular to the runway, that imaginary line from 15 to 33 went across here, and we're just going to turn to the right such that that runway is now on a 45-degree angle across our little airplane right here. And now we know we're on a 45 downwind entry leg. So, and then as we approach the normal ground track for downwind for our runway, or slightly offset away from the runway for winds pushing us into the runway, or we're going to slightly offset from the normal downwind towards the runway for winds that are pushing us away from the runway. And we're going to get to that here specifically, but we can now begin our turn. So here we are approaching our normal ground track for downwind, or we're going to offset as required for winds. And then we start as a slight right-hand turn to enter that downwind. So there it is. And then we're going to roll out if I can make this thing time. And sure enough, we're pretty much on a pretty good downwind right there. This would be a no wind or tailwind downwind, heading opposite direction of our runway of 15. In other words, the reciprocal. And that's how we've kind of, and by the way, we're looking outside while we're doing this. I don't even look in here until I'm done rolling out on whatever heading I think I should be. So as I approach the airfield from 5 to 7 miles out, we know how the winds are going to affect us. Maybe there's no winds at all. I'm using the primary run, using the runway as my primary ground reference. I roll out on what should be a good downwind. I look in and bam, perfect. Or perhaps I look in and I've underturned by 10 degrees, which means I have a converging vector towards the runway, which is going to put my base position too close to where it should be. And we'll talk about how that will affect our turn. So I'm not looking at this during the turn. This is not an instrument procedure. Your eyes need to be out, deconflicting from traffic, but this is a technique you can use in the pattern to QC where you're at relative to how parallel to the runway, or 90 degrees to the runway that you are. And when you turn crosswind, obviously our heading would be what? 060. It would be 90 degrees off what the runway is. And then when I turn to a downwind again, I should be on about a 33. Again, that assumes no wind. I'd put in a correction angle, obviously based on the winds. Now, when I'm turning base, there's a technique we're going to talk about where we can look down at this to QC how well we're doing with regards to our base turn and the amount of altitude we're losing in the turn versus how much of the turn we have out of the way. And we'll talk about that in another snippet. All right, cool. I hope you enjoyed that little insert, if you will, into our main brief. And I noticed that covered this phase here where we're at 45 entry, and then we make our turn right here. And we discussed how we would potentially offset for winds. So we've offset for winds. In this particular picture, there are no winds, or maybe we have a slight tailwind, meaning the wind is blowing down the runway like it should be in the perfect world. So all we're going to do now is just still build that 3D picture in our brain. We should already have it built, keeping track of where people are at. And then we're just waiting for some key trigger points to occur in the pattern for us to take action. So the next action is a beam the numbers. First of all, we're going to make sure that our before landing checklist is done. Gear down, flaps if as required if your checklist says put them down at this point prior to base turn. Landing lights on. We're going to get our prop. We're going to get our mixture. We're going to check our gas. We're going to swap the tanks if need be, etc. Everything in it, and your whole LC gumps and anything else that's in your before landing checklist is complete, because now it's going to start to get busy. So our first trigger point and what we're going to do, and again, a lot of this is technique driven, but when I am a beam my touchdown point at the numbers, I take some action. That is a trigger point. So I'm going to reduce the power to 1800 RPM. For the airplanes I fly predominantly, I find 1800 works. For Cessna 172s, usually it's 1500 RPM. But I'm going to reduce the power. I'm going to lower the nose 10 degrees, nose low. I'm going to go one notch of flaps. When I go 10 degrees nose low and I lower the flaps, there's not much of a relative pitch change between the two. But if I don't lower that nose and go one notch of flaps, what's my aircraft going to do? It's going to climb. And so all these beautiful traffic pattern altitudes that I've adhered to up to this point now are just thrown to the wind because I lowered flaps without lowering the nose. So 10 degrees nose low, one notch of flaps. And in this specific airplane, Cherokee/Warrior, I'm slowing to 90 miles per hour. Ideally, again, it's all POH driven, but typically your base turn speed is 10 knots or miles per hour above your final approach speed. So we're going to slow to 90. And that doesn't mean I'm racking down the speed. I'm not chopping the throttle to idle to go from 100 straight to 90. I am just setting a power setting and letting that needle drift down from 100 to 99 to 97 to 95. Oh, here it comes. Here comes 90. And by the time we get to 90, we're actually going to end up being at our base position, and we're going to start our base turn. And it's interesting that if all these parameters play out like they're supposed to, you almost don't have to touch much of the throttle at all during your base turn. because your descent from traffic pattern altitude will keep your energy level up. So even though you've reduced power, you can actually slow to 90 and then eventually final approach speed almost without touching the throttle. So how do we go from 100 to 90? Well, we reduce power. How do we go from 90 to 80 when we're on final? You're going this other 2 notches of flaps. And that's kind of how it's done. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to touch the throttle, but I'm just kind of telling you how all these are intertwined and how they relate to each other. So again, beam to touchdown point, power 1800, notes 10 degrees nose low. That's about 4 to 5 fingers, about a fist or so. I'm making the horizon line move up in my windscreen. I'm pitching the nose down 10 degrees. Not looking at the ADI. This is all sight picture. Flaps, 1 notch. If I have a flap gauge, confirm that I am 1 notch of flap set, and then I'm going to let the aircraft slow to 90 miles per hour. The next thing I'm looking for now is my next trigger point. Looking for 45 degrees off my shoulder. So I'm looking out the left shoulder. Another reason why we do left-hand traffic patterns as a standard, right? Remember when we talked about that? So I'm looking out the left side. Here's my numbers / my touchdown point. And I'm looking inside, checking airspeed, looking outside over the left shoulder, and looking for traffic on final. That's what this red cone is for. Now, a lot of times at uncontrolled airfields, you have experimental aircraft, sport aircraft, home built kits, ultralights, a lot of people flying without radios, and they could be on a straight in. Straight in is not the most ideal way to enter a traffic pattern for this reason right here. They should be entering like we just discussed, but people still do it. So I'm looking for the taxi light, the landing light, or both, whatever people have turned on final, or the little dot that's moving, and that dot is probably going to be where? Below, well below my horizon, because he's not far from touchdown. So know where to look eyes-wise, putting your eyes to look for that traffic, and then back over my left shoulder. Now, everything's set. I don't have any other switches to move. I'm just flying the airplane, looking for the sight picture, and I say to myself, 45 degrees, traffic, check airspeed, 45 degrees, check traffic, airspeed, 45 degrees, check for traffic, airspeed, etc. Waiting for my next trigger point. And then, bam, we're there. 45 degrees off, I'm looking right over the shoulder, or maybe my IP tells me if you're landing 1.5 and you happen to be over Highway 24 / the big R white roof building here, you're about at your base turn point. So at the 45 degree point, another notch of flaps, I'm pitching the nose over about another 5 to 6 degrees, and I'm going into 30 to 40 degrees of bank. It all kind of depends on winds and my base position, my downwind / base position, and I'm just starting my turn. And we're going to talk about the sight picture you're looking for as we continue this left turn around to intercept our visual glide path so that we can be on a perfect final at about a mile out away from the runway on the proper altitude. And I'm just paying attention to the airspeed, and I'm going to keep that 80 miles an hour. Let me take that back. I'm going to keep that 90 miles per hour. I want to have 10 knots or 10 miles per hour above my final approach speed. Think about this. The numbers that are calculating your POH for stall, when you see that airspeed for stall at full flaps, what does that assume? That assumes typically max gross weight oftentimes, or they may actually tell you, no, this is for half gross weight, whatever's published, but it assumes no bank angle, right? But what do we have here? Bank angle, right? Because we're in a turn. And so what does our stall speed do when we have bank in the aircraft? It goes up. So our stall margin has narrowed, and we want to widen it back up by 10 knots or 10 miles per hour, depends on your aircraft. So that's why we typically fly base turns at about 10 knots, 10 miles an hour above final approach speed. Now, again, refer to your aircraft manual. It will be very specific, but you'll find it's usually around 10 miles per hour. This is also why, by the way, if your POH has no flap landing procedures spelled out, they'll tell you add 10 more miles per hour, sometimes 15. It depends on the aircraft, to all your airspeeds. So your downwind, your base, and your final, we're adding an extra 10 knots, 15 knots, whatever your POH says. So just keep that in mind. So that's the target airspeed I'm looking for based on whether it's flap, no flap, etc. And then start my turn right there. So, yeah, okay. So I'll go ahead and just do this. Here's another picture of zoomed in. I thought I was going to talk about something else, but I'm not. So here's my numbers when I did my 1800 RPM, 10 degrees nose low, slowing to 80, my final turn speed and final turn airspeed and putting in a notch of flaps. And then I hit that 45, I'm sorry, over here, hit that 45-degree point, and then we start our turn right here. Sorry about that, had to cough. So a normal glide path, and this includes busy airports or little airports out in the country like Meadow Lake, are typically 2.5 to 3 degree glide path. And I want you to picture, here's our runway, I want you to picture that glide path as a plane, and I don't mean P-L-A-N-E as an airplane, I mean P-L-A-N-E as in a plane in geometry. So of course, just like a flat a triangular piece of plywood that whose pointy end is on the runway, and then it fans out into infinity. And we're looking at it edge on right here. And you could look at, again, back in our chart supplement that I showed you earlier, you could look in there and find out what the glide path is for that particular airfield. Now, they'll publish it typically when there's a PAPI, Precision Approach Path Indicator in this case, or a VASI or something like that. Or if there's an ILS, they'll tell you what the ILS glide slope angle is. But here, notice they've got two of them. They got 3.0, which is within the range here. This one's a little steeper. It's a ½ degree steeper than normal. When you roll out on final, that's because right here there's a road and there's power lines. They don't mention that as well, but they give you the reason why they've steepened it up a little bit. They want to keep you well off that road. They don't want you dragging landing gear through power lines and pickup trucks. So they've steepened it a little bit over here. Look over here at Cannon Air Force Base out in New Mexico. You'll find that runway 04, it's 2.5 degrees. For runway 22, it's 3 degrees. For whatever reason, I don't know. Maybe there's sometimes there's some rising terrain or undulating terrain or some little bit of hills, or maybe there's, a senator's got a ranch out there and he or she doesn't want to be flown over low, or whatever the case may be. But with all that being said, picture that glide path, whatever it is, however it's published, extending out from the beginning of the runway all the way out to infinity. And we want to turn our aircraft to intercept that glide path and then fly it on in. Ideally, in a perfect world with a 2.5 to 3 degree glide path, you should roll out on final, wings level, about a mile away. That's a nautical mile, by the way. A nautical mile, and the math shows you'll be about 300 feet AGL. In fact, here's the math. Here's the math down here. 2.5 degrees, you'll be 266. 3 degrees, you'll be 319 feet. I just call it 300 for easy math. I got a small walnut-sized brain, and I've got to just stick to some known numbers here. So again, this is almost the perfect final approach picture, all things being equal, lined up with centerline, what we call extended centerline of the runway, a mile out, 300 feet AGL, wings level, on final approach airspeed. So I want to just have a discussion about how we can use our instruments in some mathematics. And this doesn't mean during the final turn I am flying instruments. I am not staring at my instruments. But in this left-hand final turn, I'm looking out at the runway, and then my eyes have to scan all the way across the front of my airplane over to the right to look for traffic. So why can't my eyes just real quick look down and just take a mental picture, quality control, kind of QC how well I'm doing during this base turn? So think about this for a second. Our base turn is a 180-degree turn. Remember that. So if we start 1,000 feet above the ground and we end up 300 feet above the ground, then we lost some altitude during that turn. And how much did we lose? Well, we lose 700 feet in the 180-degree turn. So if our altimeter, so in the 180-degree turn, we lose 700. So in 90 degrees of turn, in other words, halfway through our base turn, we should lose about half of this, which is 350. 350. So if we started at 7,900 on the clock, on the altimeter, and we lose 350, then halfway through the final turn, our altimeter should read 7,550. In my mind, that's 7,500 because I can fly 50 feet precision with these old school clock altimeters, but I'm in the middle of a final turn. So I'm looking for 7,500. So in other words, halfway through the turn, we should be halfway down, and guess what? An altitude of 7,500. So let me show you. We're going to break from this main video, and I'm going to jump over and show you a video of how you can set up the instruments in your cockpit to be able to use this technique. And I think I mentioned in there, I can't remember because again, I build these snippets at different time frames. I use this technique every now and then. And it's been taught to me, but I kind of use a sight picture and I can tell when I'm going to be below or above or on glide path without doing the math here. But this is a technique that's used by many people that I've flown with, works real well, and it gives you an idea of it gives you a method to predict where you're going to be on final 90 degrees before you're even there. So let's go to that snippet and we'll talk about that real quick and then come back. All right, guys, another video insert here. And so here we are approaching our base turn, and our heading is 330, parallel and opposite the direction of our active runway of 55. And now we're going to talk about the technique that I just already talked about in the primary video, where folks are using the halfway around, halfway down, or halfway down, halfway around, whatever rhyme you want to memorize. But basically, if I have 180 degrees to turn and a certain amount of altitude to lose in that turn, then ideally in 90 degrees of turn, I should lose half of that required altitude. So here's what some folks will set up, and I've seen this technique. First of all, if you don't have an HSI, and if you don't have a heading bug, you can still do this technique, right? We know 3-3 is right here. This is opposite the direction of our runway of 1-5. And we know halfway around this 180 degree turn is a heading of what? 240. And you don't have to do the math. Just look at the 90 degree tick mark over here and look at the heading that's underneath that tick mark. 240. If you have an HSI or if you have Luber lines on your compass rose, you could look over here and see that 90 degree Luber line and know that halfway through the turn, we should be pointing a heading of 240. But if you have a heading bug, which we do here, let's go ahead and set that heading bug. And we can do this approaching the airfield, right? We don't have to do it while we're at base. And by the way, once you're in base turn, you can look down and do it visually if you want, but you're doing higher priority things, right, in base. At base versus sit down here and trying to do instrument stuff. So here we go. We got the heading bug set on 240. Now let's suppose we're at base and let's start our left-hand turn. And I may have to pause this to make the simulator work right. And by the way, you will not see the ADI pitch down. So normally you'd be what? We'd be about 10 degrees nose low in this turn. You won't see that, but let's see if we can at least get a turn going here. And we do. So we're going to rack up 30 degrees of bank, which is a pretty good number to hang your hat on. And here comes the turn. So I'm saying halfway down, halfway around, halfway down, halfway around. Our altimeter will not be decreasing in this simulator, but it would be in the turn because we'd be about 10 degrees nose low. And then I'm going to freeze it here because we're not going to roll out bank, but I am going to freeze the simulator. Now we are halfway through our 180 degree turn to final. By the way, I'm still under the weather, so that's why I have this, I don't know, this slurring of speech. I'm not on medicine or anything like that. Just that's my excuse. So I'm halfway through the turn, 90 degrees through the turn. In other words, the heading bug is on the nose. If we didn't have a heading bug, we know what that heading would be, about a 240. And again, I am not staring at this. It is simply part of my normal cross check because I'm already looking inside and doing what? Making sure the engine instruments are good. I'm already looking inside and doing what? Making sure I'm on my base turn airspeed. I'm already going from the runway over kind of at my left shoulder to in front of me and looking out to the right. Why? Because I'm looking for traffic on final. So as my eyes sweep back and forth through the instrument panel, I'm just going to glance down and go 270 for 240, 260 for 240, 250 for 240. There's 240, halfway around, 7,500 feet. Man, we got this nailed. And I'm continuing the turn through. And I don't look at this again. Once I kind of look at this this measuring stick at this particular instant time, I can assess how high I am relative to where I need to be. So suppose that if our halfway down, halfway around altitude is 7,500, and we get to this point and we see 7,700, what can you predict about where you'll be in relation to the glide path once we roll out on final? You'll be 200 feet high. So instead of being at 1 mile at 300 feet AGL, you're going to be at 1 mile, 500 feet AGL. So what can I do when I still have 90 degrees of turn left over to get rid of that 200-foot error? Well, I can lower the nose a little bit. I can also increase bank. Here we got about 28 degrees of bank. I can increase a bank to 32, 33. Because, you know, all things being equal, if I increase bank angle, I'll descend at a greater rate. So this is a great example of us fixing our final position before we're even on final, right? What if the opposite is true? What if we're halfway around the turn, 90 degrees, heading 240, and I know I should be about 7,500 feet, but I look in and I'm 7,300 feet. Well, I know that I'm going to be 200 feet low when I roll out on final, and that should get your attention, by the way. 100 feet AGL at a mile out should get your attention. So what can I do? Well, I can take out some of that bank angle, but remember, if I take out bank angle, now I'm not turning at the rate I want, and the winds may be affecting me. Or I could just keep the turn coming, but raise the nose up a little bit. Maybe put it towards the horizon. Fix this error while we still have 90 degrees of turn remaining versus rolling out on final and going, man, I'm low. Let me fix it. No, fix it during the turn. So this is the halfway down, halfway around technique that I just talked about. And of course, again, if we don't have an HSI, horizontal situation indicator, we certainly have a compass rose down here, or a gyro compass that you could look down at and use your heading bug if you have one for your halfway down, halfway around technique. And even if you don't have the bug, as your nose sweeps through 240, you should be at 7,500 feet. That's your halfway down altitude. And if not, you can correct accordingly, like we talked about. All right, so I hope that made sense. And I know I repeated some stuff in this video as well as a snippet, but that gives you an idea how you can use your avionics to do the halfway down, halfway around technique. And here's a slide depicting that. I start at 7,900 feet, halfway around the turn, 90 degrees, the left-hand turn. I should be at 7,500 feet on the clock. If I'm slightly below that, then that tells me I'm going to be slightly below glide path if I keep the same turn coming. If I'm high, in other words, 7,700 feet, and I keep the same kind of turn coming, then guess what? I'm going to be about 200 feet high on final. I'm going to be a mile from the touchdown, not at 300 feet AGL, but 500 feet AGL, which is not where I want to be. So this gives me a great opportunity to QC my turn and do something in this last half of the turn to fix it now, because we don't want to roll out on final and then start fixing things. And if you ever transition to the world of instrument flying, that is one of the most important concepts that you could grasp, is that if something's not right, fix it as soon as possible. Catch it early, nip it in the bud, whatever term you want to use, because it's about to get even more busier. So we want to erase that variable in the equation and turn it to a constant. There are some things that you need to be doing when you roll out on final here, and one of them does not include fixing a 200-foot error in your altitude. We want to fix that here, and we talked about how to do that. All right, awesome. And I'm looking for traffic, so there's our halfway around, halfway down, halfway around technique. Whatever technique you use, you should be looking for this traffic on final, right? I actually roll out for a second, particularly with a low wing airplane. If I'm on the left-hand turn, I can't see through that aluminum skinned wing, so I need to roll out, check final, about 1 potato, 2 potato, 3 potato, and then back in the turn. And I will tell you, since I know that I rolled out and drove straight for a few seconds, this next part of the turn, I'm actually going to be just a little more aggressive in the turn to make up for that droning straight ahead for those 3 to 4 seconds, looking on traffic. But that's just my technique. The point is, whatever your technique is, you need to be looking that direction for traffic. That is the high threat area right now. And now we're halfway through the turn. I'm sorry, 3/4 of the way through the turn. I'm going to go full flaps. By the way, we probably did another notch of flaps. I think I mentioned it. No, so we did initial flaps. We'll do another notch of flaps about right here, and then full flaps rolling out on final, and we're going to intercept that 2.5 to 3 degree visual glide path. And then power is required to capture that final approach speed. For the aircraft, for the majority of you folks watching this, Cherokees and Warriors is 80 miles an hour. Just refer to your POH. And now I'm looking for traffic on final. Somebody that I didn't see, somebody that's not making radio calls. I have had at Meadow Lake somebody holding short here, and as I'm rolling out on final, and I made all my radio calls, by the way, so they should have heard me, but perhaps they don't have a radio. Maybe they didn't see me. But they pulled out onto the runway and started their takeoff roll. Unfortunately, they were airborne before I crossed the number, so I didn't have to go around. But man, be ready for anything. Be ready. Some of these fields don't have fences around them. Be ready for the cow. Be ready for the school bus that's lost on the air. I mean, I'm making stuff up, but there are many, many reasons that you're going to have to go around, and you want to find those early. So your cross check is for traffic on final, and then looking at this high threat area here at your, or in and around your touchdown point, especially at an uncontrolled airfield. People do crazy things. Now I've drawn this out. This is my best attempt to describe to you in a video what I am picturing in my mind. So this blue triangular plane, or flight path, glide path, visual approach path, whatever term you want to use, starts on brick 1 of the runway. Relative to the ground, it is 3.5 degrees for this runway, or 3 degrees, but in my mind it's 2.5 to 3 degrees. And by the way, I've flown for many years, so I kind of can picture this in my mind, but if I can establish it in your mind now as a young pilot, then you can flow into this technique and hopefully it will work for you. But this glide path extends all out into infinity, up to the moon. It doesn't matter. But our turn, our base turn, is going to intercept that glide path. So we are turning in a plane also. And again, I don't mean airplane, a plane of motion, a plane of motion. And our plane of motion is going to intersect that plane. And if you remember in your basic geometry, you know, for example, the intersection of two planes that converge is what? It's a line, right? The intersection of two lines is a point. All this stuff you can remember. And another depiction of what I've showed you here is right here. So this green line represents our turning plane, and the blue line here represents the glide path plane. Again, planar geometry. Planar geometry is what we're talking about. And my turn is going to bring me to an intercept point where these two planes intercept. That's my target point. And so I'm looking at the runway, and I can just visualize that glide path coming off, and I'm flying my base turn in terms of pitch and power as required to intercept this thing. Now, it ought to be picture perfect if I've done the halfway down, halfway around technique. So my nose swings through 340 and I'm at 7,500 feet on the clock. Well, then this should play out pretty darn spot on. But that's what I'm looking for right there. And again, another way to depict it, I've drawn the airplane with a green line, but here I've actually drawn two different planes. This is my turning plane, or my plane of motion. Here's the glide path plane, and I'm going to fly so that my plane of motion intercepts. Well, I'm going to fly my airplane, so I intercept the point at which my turning plane and the glide path plane intercept each other. I hope that makes sense. And then, of course, we roll out on final. Again, 1 nautical mile from touchdown. We're 300 feet AGL, and we're right at the intersection of those two planes. Looking outside, using the runway as our primary reference, this is a picture that if you saw, you ought to be able to tell yourself this is very steep. Because picture that glide path plane, it isn't coming up above our heads, man. That'd be so steep, it's ridiculous. Also notice, see that first taxiway right here on the runway, and then the second taxiway? You can make out right now from this vantage point some distance between the two. In other words, there's some angular separation between the two, about a degree, I don't know, whatever that is, some angular separation. You ought to be able to tell that this is a very steep picture, that we need to correct this very, very quickly. Throttle idle, get the flaps down, let's get the nose down as well, and let's fix this while we're in the base turn so we'll have it nailed by the time we roll out on final. So that is what a steep picture looks like. Now, what about this one? Well, I've got it there on the slide for you. It's too shallow. Again, back to this one. Look at the first runway, second runway. See how I got lots of angular separation between the two? Well, look at this. You can't even discern the two. I can't even tell which is first. Look, I was even pointing at that, thinking it was the runway. Here's your runway. I don't even see taxiways because they're so narrow from this angular view. There's almost no angular separation. In fact, think about this in theory. If we were on a 10-foot ladder on the ground looking at this runway a mile and a quarter away, would we see any angular separation at all whatsoever in those taxiways? No. So if we take it to the other extreme, in other words, super high, you see a lot of angular separation. So this is a sight picture between being really steep and really shallow that as your aeronautical experience increases and you build time in the airplane, you're going to be able to see these pictures and immediately know I'm too steep or I'm too shallow or this is spot on. But I wanted to show you what this looks like in a left-hand turn from the left seat. Too steep, too shallow. And here's just an example of where I just kind of zoomed in and shown you here that a lot of angular separation here. It's almost like you're over the airfield almost from this vantage point. The buildings appear longer. Here they appear shorter when you're shallow. And look, I can't even tell. Look, I was pointing at that again, the taxiway. I can't even tell where the first or next taxiway is coming down the runway because we are so shallow right now. So let's talk about if we fly the normal base position. We're going to talk about now wind correction. So if I fly the normal base position, no wind correction whatsoever, and I fly the normal base turn that I'm used to, because when we do turns, you actually are pulling G's. It may not be very much, but you're pulling G's. And you can feel those G's in your rear end. We call that, seat of the pants flying or, feel of the aircraft and all that. So if you do everything normal in this base turn and don't account for this wind over here that's blowing in from the east, you are going to roll out on final too far west of the center line. The middle of the runway, if we extend that off into infinity, we call that the runway's extended center line. We obviously want to roll out dead center on the extended center line, but here the wind has blown us off course. This is normal base position, bank angle, and G's with overshooting winds. What we should have done was offset our base position into the wind. Here you'll notice we're right over the big white building like I talked about, but here we've offset our base position into the wind so that our 45-degree off mark, all right, that's our cue, right, for taking action. We did the same number of G's, same bank angle, and did everything, and guess what? We now roll out on center line. In fact, it's interesting, the offset that we would have had in the wrong direction is equal to the offset of our base position. So all we did was just drag our whole pattern over to the right by, I don't know, 300 feet or whatever is needed to account for that wind. And that's how we correct for what I have over here, overshooting winds. We fly the proper base position, and we may have to use a little bit more bank angle during this turn to get the turn out of the way quicker. We don't want to just be lazy in this turn because we'll float all the way over here. So we want to adjust if we need to our bank angle and how aggressive we are in the turn. At the same time, adjust our base position here. This is the primary way to account for winds. And remember that picture of the wing that we had? The runway was on the wing tip in this particular example. This is, I have this in red, and I have the other one in red, although it's not dangerous. But this one is dangerous because here's what happens. We overshoot the runway and then realize, oh my gosh, this really looks bad. And then we maneuver our aircraft fairly aggressive because, one, we're pissed. Number two, we're running out of time because we went from 1 mile from final to now we're 3/4 of a mile from final, and we're still not lined up with the runway. And we get aggressive on this turn. And meanwhile, what's dangerous about this? We're maneuvering the airplane. We've slowed the final approach airspeed, and we are close to the ground, and we are putting bank angle with G on the airplane. And that's not what that flap down stall figure assumed, did it? So here we are, instead of wings level, smoking a cigarette, just taking our time, coming down final, we're G'ing up the aircraft, banking it left and right, and jacking around with the power because, your airspeed is going to be all over the place, whereas we should have fixed it here. And remember on a number of slides back, I said, especially during instrument flying, anything that we know is not going to be pretty or is messed up, we want to fix it early. So this mistake right here could have been fixed when? Not even here. We could have fixed it when we entered the 45-degree traffic pattern right here. We could have turned early because we know the winds were behind us. So look how early we made a correction for a problem that we knew was going to exist over here. That's the connection I'm trying to make in some of these wind correction topics I'm talking about in this video. So back to where I was at. There we go. So this is the picture we want to roll out on centerline. I'm not going to talk about crosswind landings in this video, but we don't want, again, still don't want the wind to drift us over. So we have to put in our crosswind landing controls, and for different aircraft, that's different procedures. And You can message me or talk to me, and I'll tell you what they are for our Cherokee and Warrior. Most of the time, it's low wing. It's a low wing technique. In other words, into the wind. We're going to bank into the wind, and you use rudder to align the fuselage with the center line. So let's go here. This shouldn't have been in red, but it is. I forgot to change the color. I have this in red because this is the most dangerous one. This one is still not pretty, and it's still wrong, but it's not as dangerous because as I start my rollout, I see that I'm not on extended center line. I can just roll out completely, go wings level, and just drive straight ahead to fix this picture. Now, I have this red arrow drawn wrong. If you've rolled out in what we call undershooting wings, in other words, if we have undershot extended center line, you don't want to drive for the numbers. You want to drive over here somewhere. Remember, we want to be lined up a mile away from the runway. So we're not just going to drive at the runway. I see this mistake often. Just drive into the runway. No, we need to be lined up with it over here. So roll out and maybe even turn back right again to fix this and intercept extended center line over here. If you do the halfway down, halfway around and find that you're not even going to be lined up with the runway, if you keep your turn coming the way you're doing, you can ease up the bank angle and you can ease up the G, so we float this turn around and then roll out on extended center line. Or we can fix this very, very early before any of this ever occurred and offset our downwind position. So here's our nice white building reference we talked about earlier, but notice we've offset into the wind so that if we start our base at the same 45-degree over the shoulder picture, we do the same kind of G, the same kind of power settings, the same kind of timing with our flaps, everything very, very routine, and the same amount of bank angle in our base turn, we will end up rolling out, lined up on extended center line, right where we need to be. And of course, we still need to crab into the wind so the winds now don't take out our beautiful final approach picture. And again, use our crosswind landing techniques to maintain extended center line and continue to keep those crosswind controls locked in even all the way during touchdown. So this is how you can fix what we call undershooting wing. So undershooting wind. So again, this is overshooting wind because it's pushing you, it will overshoot you past extended line. And this is undershooting because you're going to undershoot extended center line. And that's where those two terms come from. And again, there's that corrected base position we've already talked about. So assuming we've corrected for winds, so there's no winds now, back to this, we're looking down at the high threat area, which is going to be that first taxiway, particularly at an uncontrolled airfield. And if you look there and see an airplane holding short, man, you better go just a radar lock on that guy, because I've seen, it's like I can tell it's like in my mind, I think they see me because they're sitting there waiting, and all of a sudden they taxi out onto the runway, and you're like, you got to be kidding me. So here we are rolling out on final, extended center line, 7,200 feet MSL, that's 300 feet AGL, at final approach airspeed of 80 miles per hour, or whatever airplane it is you fly. I use 80 because of our Cherokees and Warriors. And we're looking for traffic here. Not only that first taxiway, but that second one, because some people will pull out there too as well. And if we know there was somebody ahead of us in the traffic pattern, in other words, they turned base while we were on downwind, and then we reach base position, now they are on final. I'm watching them too, because sometimes they'll say touch and go, and then all of a sudden they do what? They decide to full stop. And I cannot touch the runway if they're still on the runway. That will not happen. And if you're at a controlled tower and that happens, tower is going to make you go around. So watch that traffic out in front of you and make sure, A, that they didn't decide to do a full stop, and B, that they're actually off the runway when you cross the numbers, right? Otherwise, you need to do a go around. And if you ever do a go around with an aircraft still on the runway, offset one side or the other. At Meadow Lake, I would offset to the inside. I'd fly over the grass between the parallel runway and the main runway. Why won't I fly offset to the right? Because I've got a grass strip over there, right, with glider operation. So, and tower at a controlled airfield, tower will tell you oftentimes, if it's not already in local procedures in writing, they'll tell you, hey, offset left, offset right, etc. when you go around. And if they don't, they just assume you to fly right over the runway. But you typically do not want to overfly aircraft on the taxiway or runway. Now let's talk about sight position. Okay, when you roll out, when your IP flies the perfect demonstrated pattern for you and rolls out on final, I want you to take a snapshot of where the aim point is. That's the point on the runway that we're aiming for, and it's right at the beginning of the runway. Some people use the stripes, some people use the numbers. Some fighter aircraft, they use brick 1 because that airplane's going to float and they need to get on the runway ASAP to get stopped. But I want you to freeze this picture. Now, it's going to move around a little bit. There's bumpy winds, and there's some shifting left, shifting right. And you're going to see it in the video here in a second. But ideally, always come back to this sight picture. That is your touchdown point, and we want to freeze it. In other words, we don't want any line of sight. Remember, if there's 0 line of sight, what are we on? A collision course. So I don't want any line of sight upwards. In other words, this shouldn't drift up in my windscreen, and it shouldn't drift down in my windscreen. And remember what happens to something when we're on a collision course with it? It doesn't move left, right, up, or down, but it does what? It gets bigger. So same thing here. Some little white spot that I can't tell what it is, suddenly it turns into a bigger white spot, and then suddenly it's a big 1 and 5 painted numbers for the runway. So these details will begin to emerge as this thing gets bigger. But I don't want it drifting up, and I don't want it drifting down. I'm freezing this picture. Now my cross check is aim point, airspeed. Aim point, airspeed. I'm looking out. I'm looking in. I'm looking out. I'm looking in. Now let's talk about something here that's very important. You will hear many, many times, and some instructors teach only this, some stay away from it completely, and some kind of use a hybrid mix of the two. They will talk about, well, what if I'm slightly fast on final? In other words, let's say I'm 85 miles an hour. How do I fix that? Well, you can pitch the nose slightly up, and then that will bleed off your airspeed. Okay. If you're a little slow, you can pitch down, and that brings up your airspeed. But if I pitch down, won't I increase my descent rate? Initially, yes, but as that airspeed comes back up to where it should be, now you got more airflow across the wings, and now you're generating more lift to account for what would have been an increase in the descent rate. The other factor, and what's cool about PowerPoint while I'm recording is I can draw this out. Your horizontal tail at the back of the airplane, in most general aviation airplanes, this is going to be ugly, I know. It's an inverted airfoil. So it's a wing, but it's turned upside down. Okay, this is a very important concept when we talk about pitch for airspeed and power for pitch. Okay, so let's not look at this just for a second, although I drew it. So we talked about airspeed being off. What if my aim point begins to drift from the numbers to right here? In other words, I need to bring the nose back up. I need to bring my aim point back up. Well, logic would say just pull on the controls to bring the nose up. Well, those who preach power for pitch and pitch for airspeed will tell you, hey, just add a little bit of power. Well, what that does is that increases the airflow across this upside down wing. That's your horizontal stabilizer. And since now, because this thing is designed to be upside down, the lift is in the downward direction. That's a little arrow. I know it's ugly, which causes the tail to go down and the nose to go up. So that is why applying a little bit of power will bring your nose up slightly, and that is why many, many times, in fact, I think the majority of instructors teach a power for pitch, and if I have to fix airspeed, then use pitch to control airspeed. I don't teach that. I teach kind of a hybrid version, and there's a reason behind it. There is no other phase of flight in which I do that. So why during landing do I want to start doing it now? Let me give you an example. Okay, suppose I'm at 9,000 feet. I'm supposed to hold that altitude, and then all of a sudden, and by the way, I'm flying 100 miles an hour at 9,000 feet, and I look inside, and I've just picked up about 100 feet per minute climb on the VVI, and I start to see the altimeter begin to slowly increase. Am I going to pull the power to fix that? No. What am I going to do? I'm going to reach down between my legs or between us and just roll one little knob of trim forward to fix that. And I may push slightly forward on the controls. In other words, I'm using pitch to control that altitude, right? I'm not pulling the power to stop climbing and then push the power back up, because if I do that and push the power back up to capture airspeed, what's the aircraft going to do? It's going to start climbing again. So in other words, if I'm climbing and shouldn't be, we push forward on the controls. If I'm descending and shouldn't be, I pull back on the controls to stop and to slow and stop the descent and get back to altitude. That's how we control altitude. So why change that in the traffic pattern? That's just my thoughts. So what I teach and what I fly, and been doing it for the better part of 3 decades, almost 3, is if my aim point is low, in other words, short of the runway, down here somewhere, I pull back on the controls to get the aim point back up here. So if the crosshairs are down here, I pull back, I bring the crosshairs up to here. Now, if I have got 80 miles an hour perfectly locked in, and my aim point's way down here, and I bring the nose up to fix the aim point, what's going to happen to that 80 miles an hour? It'll turn into 79 and 78 and 77 and 76. The reason why is because I'm not descending now. We're not giving altitude back to God, right? In other words, I'm telling him, hey, I'm not going to descend at the rate that I was earlier. And he's going to say, well, then I'm taking away some of your airspeed. So I may have to reach down. In fact, I will tell you almost every time you will, reach down to the throttle and just nudge it, just barely thinking about moving it forward. 100, maybe 150 RPM, something like that. Because I'm now slowed my descent. I'm demanding more lift out of the wings by increasing my pitch, and an increase in lift means an increase in drag. So I have to compensate for that drag by an increase in power ever so slightly. Now, what if my aim point is short and I look down and I'm 85 miles an hour? I'm 5 miles an hour fast, and I bring my aim point up. What am I going to do with the power? Nothing. I'm going to let that airspeed slowly drift down to 80, and maybe it'll slow down its rate and stop at around 80. The other picture would be I've got a high aim point. In other words, I'm pointing long of where I should be, and I need to pitch the nose down. I push forward on the controls to get the aim point back here. If I was at 80 miles an hour and I bring the nose lower to fix the aim point, what's going to happen to my airspeed? It will increase. So I need to pull the power back some to compensate now for that different pitch change. That is what I teach. So it's kind of a hybrid of the two. And the reason why is that there's no other phase in flight in which I need 5 miles an hour more airspeed. So let's just pitch the nose down. You can't do that if you're on an IFR clearance, or if you're a VFR and told to stay at 9,000 because of airspace below you, right? We use throttle to control airspeed. So I'm using throttle to control airspeed through all phases of flight. So that's my pitch on that, no pun intended. Now, what does this picture look like? That is steep. That is steep. Our aim point, which was about 3 fingers or so above this glare shield, well, look where it's at. It's down here, right? This is a steep picture. So that glide path is actually going underneath us. So we need to pitch down here. I won't say aggressive. That's a term I don't like to use when airplanes are on short final, but we need to be pretty quick about getting the nose down, getting down. We're high, and this is steep, getting down to that glide path and bringing the aim point back up to our normal picture. And if you have VASIs or PAPIs or any other glide slope visual indicators here, this runway here in particular has 2 lights. They both right now would be white, meaning you are well above glide path. And then how does this look? You're shallow, right? You're coming in way too low. And if we could see our 2 little PAPI lights right here, they'd both be red. So this one we have to kind of, again, I'm going to say dive down to our glide path. That doesn't mean we dive. And for you young pilots, it doesn't mean we're pushing the floor. Just we need to aggressively get down to get to that glide path. And by the way, if this happens a quarter of a mile from the runway, we're not even fixing this. We're just doing it going around, right? But if we're a mile away from the runway and see a steep picture like this, we got a little bit of time to fix it, which is why we want to be a mile away from the airplane, from the airfield, because it gives us time to fix these sight pictures. This one being real shallow, our aim point, yeah, it's spot on, but we're way too shallow. So I may bring the horizon closer to my glare shield here, maybe about 2 or 3 fingers. In other words, I'm leveling off until I drive straight ahead, and now I intercept the normal visual glide path. Then I pitch the nose over to catch that normal picture. So what I've got for you is another video that I'm going to inject into this one, and it's a landing video. You'll see the sight picture that I'm talking about, and it's a very nice landing, I have to say. But I threw some crosshairs on there to show you what the aim point is, and you will see, generally speaking, how that aim point does not move relative to our intended target. That is the stripe / number on the runway. So let's jump to it real quick, and then we'll come back. All right, folks, here we are on final runway 13, Colorado Springs. You can see Peterson Air Force Base off to the left. What we got here is looking over the cowl of the DA-40, and you can see a set of crosshairs that I have fixed relative to the windscreen / airframe. And so, yeah, the plane's making a little bit. There's some winds and whatnot. And I've got some folks with us that they were big folks. I hate to say that. But anyway, so I'm coming in here, and notice, generally speaking, the crosshairs are on the stripes. If I pass out right now and the plane keeps on flying, it is going to strike the ground right there at the stripes. Now, I begin to bring it up just a little bit because I'm starting to slow down. And as I slow down and bring the power back, I have to increase backstick pressure. In other words, increase AOA to slow my descent. Now the crosshairs are on the horizon. And boom, right there, the perfect touchdown. It brought a tear to everybody's eyes. There it is. So notice that aim point now has shifted from my target to closer to the horizon, then at the horizon, and slightly above the horizon as I begin my round out. I'm gonna watch this one more time so we can play it through. And you can obviously go through and play it back, as many times as you want. But again, crosshairs right on that end of runway. A little bit of drift left and right as, we're compensating for the winds. But generally speaking, you don't see those crosshairs coming up to the horizon. In other words, we'd be leveling off, going above glide path, and you don't see them dipping below the end of the runway because then we'd be descending at a too great of a rate below the glide path. We got PAPIs out there. It's a 4-light PAPI system, but I don't see the lights on it all. It may have been noted out. And then crossing the numbers, landing assured, power starts to come back. So I have to increase the AOA, backstick pressure on the horizon. Then I hold it here. Stall warnings going off. And then boom, touchdown right there. So hope that helps. And back to our normal video. So all things going perfect, man. Great base position, base turn, final. And now we go to our touch and go. We kind of get over the numbers and we're close to touching down, and then we kind of go, oh God, if I do nothing, at least I'm touching down and I'm safe, right? So a lot of people kind of just give up, right? Their hands are still kind of where they need to be, but they stop disciplining themselves to stay on center line and to arrest that descent rate and touch down right at, your stall horn, just above, that stall speed, then touch down as smoothly as possible, and then keep those crosswind controls in because you still have a crosswind. The airplane is still generating lift. The thing still wants to fly. The control surfaces are still effective. And if you've got a pretty good crosswind blowing, guess what? It's still going to cause you to drift across the runway because even after touchdown, until you really slow down a lot, you don't have as much friction between your wheels and the runway as you think you do, right? So you could still get pushed over to the side. So keep those crosswind controls locked in. So as we're rolling down the runway during our touch and go, keep whatever pitch feel you had. In other words, the control forces, the amount of back pressure or back travel you had on I always want to say stick, but the yoke or controls, I guess, because I don't like the word yoke. But whatever amount of travel you had back during that touchdown, you want to go forward just a little bit because when you touch down, you are at the touchdown attitude. We want to take off in the takeoff attitude. So the difference between the two isn't very much, but it's there. And you'll see that. When you touch down, the nose is pointed up fairly high, but when we take off, it's not near as high. It's a takeoff attitude versus the touchdown attitude. So we want to let the controls just come forward a little bit. And how much am I talking about? I'm talking about half a fist width. I mean, it is not much. So if I got my hand is on the control, other hand should be on the throttle. If I look down and my hand is in the my fist is in the vertical, it's about half a width of that fist, right? We're going to raise the flaps because this touch and go is going to be like a normal takeoff. And when you did your normal takeoff, it was what? Flaps up. So we're turning this into a normal takeoff. We're going to raise the flaps. We're going to go throttle full. Carb heat off if it was on in accordance with your POH. And the reason why we're turning off the carb heat, because we don't want hot air being ingested in the engine because it loses horsepower. That's why you see the RPM drop during your carb heat check on your run up. So carb heat off. Checking engine instruments, right? We want to make sure that the RPM is where it's supposed to be up there, not over, above the limits. We want to make sure oil pressure is in the green, temperature is still in the green, everything looks good. Maintain that takeoff attitude. Takeoff. You get to see a correction here, real time. Maintain that takeoff attitude. Just like on your normal takeoff back home before you got to Metal Lake, when you were VR, you didn't just rotate and rip the plane off the ground. No, you just rotated the aircraft to takeoff attitude, and you're still on the ground. You're just at takeoff attitude, takeoff pitch. And as we accelerate during this touch and go, the same thing happens. We're at takeoff attitude, and then the physics will fly the airplane for us, and we'll lift off normally and do a normal takeoff. And that's how we'll do our touch and go. If we have to go around, or in some checklists, they call it a bulk landing, it is a little bit different, and namely in terms of flaps. And let me talk about why. Right now, in this particular picture, and almost anytime you're doing a go-around, what is your direction of travel? Obviously, it's forward, but what other direction are you traveling? Downward, right? When we do this touch and go, we're not traveling downward anymore because we're already on terra firma, right? We're already on the runway. There is no descent rate at play at all here, but there is here. So a go-around in terms of energy and what we're using that energy to do goes towards accelerating, and it goes towards stop descending, right? There's a bus full of nuns that pulled out on the runway in front of us, or a herd of cows, or a group of school kids escaped from the tour, and they're out on, you can name whatever reason, but we've got to stop our descent rate, and that takes a lot of energy, and it takes a lot of what? Lift. When does this happen? Do we do a go-around when we're 80 miles an hour fast on final? No, we do a go-around when we are on airspeed. And remember that airspeed was calculated, wings level, a descent rate of 400 to 600. By the way, I didn't mention this earlier. If you are on glide path at 2.5 to 3 degrees glide path, your VVI on final should be between 400 and 600. I don't look at that on a VFR pattern, but I do look at it all the time when I'm shooting an ILS or any other kind of precision approach. I should see about 400 to 600 VVI. The point is, it still exists here, even though I'm not looking at it. So I have a 400 to 600 feet per minute descent rate that I have to arrest, in other words, stop, and I have to accelerate to get back to a safe flying airspeed. A lot of stuff is happening. So because of that, we don't just take out the flaps because we're at 80. So not only are we leveling off and even going to start a climb, but we're slow, and I don't want to take away those extra lift generating devices. Many people have landed gear up because they raised the flaps too early, either on takeoff or during a touch and go or during a go around. I have seen it myself happen. Many aircraft, the landing gear and the flaps are connected. In other words, you raise the gear, the flaps will come up automatically. And so they do a touch and go. They want to look cool. They're 10 feet off the runway. They raise the gear because it looks cool like in the movies. But guess what? Now the flaps come up and they're not at a safe flying airspeed, and the aircraft settles back down to the runway. So when I think about, and by the way, there's not time to look in the checklist for go-around procedures. So this is one that you need to have memorized. So the biggest thing I've found, because I've messed it up myself when I was learning to fly, that I found the biggest difference was the flaps. We are not raising the flaps all of the way during a go-around. So here's your general procedures. Again, refer to your specific aircraft POH for our go-around. We're going to go throttle full, carb heat off, and if we had turned it on per our checklist. And then the flaps, we're only going to go up one notch on those flaps. In other words, we're going to raise them. So if there's 3 positions for our flaps, 1 notch, 2 notch, 3 knots, or 10 degrees, 25 degrees, and 40, we're going to go from 40 to 25 degrees. And here's why. Aeronautically speaking, there is almost no difference in lift between full flaps and 25-degree flaps, or sometimes called half flaps. Almost no difference whatsoever in lift. The difference is in drag. That's why we go full flaps during landing, is because of the drag. So that when I bring the power to idle, I got all that drag hanging out there to get me slowed down so I can stop on the runway safely. But now I don't care about drag, but I got to keep the lift. So let's get rid of that drag, but keep the lift. And we do that by raising the flaps up to 1 notch. And then we need to stop the descent. And this doesn't mean we jack the nose up and we start this cool, refreshing climb. That just means we arrest that descent. And if I am 20 feet off the ground, the aggressiveness that I use to stop that descent is going to be different than if I'm 300 feet AGL, a mile out and somebody tells me to go around. So we're going to accelerate to VX or VY. Look in your POH for the number specific to your aircraft. We're going to accelerate to VX if we're trying to avoid an obstacle off the end of the runway like trees or something, a cliff that for some reason they built a runway out there. I'm going to accelerate to VX, climb at VX to avoid that object if it's there. Once I've avoided the obstacle, then I will lower the nose a little bit, accelerate to VY. Then I'll climb out at VY. So we're going to climb out at best angle first if there's an obstacle, and then climb out at best rate, which is VY, once we've cleared that obstacle. Or if there's no obstacle at all, we're just going to accelerate to VY. That's our best rate, climb rate airspeed, and then climb out at that speed. And we're just going to do a gentle climb, right? We don't want to get crazy. The airplane is low to the ground. It is slow. And this is kind of I won't call this an emergency, but it's something you got to take very serious and adhere to the checklist procedures. Most importantly, do not raise those flaps all the way because you will descend back down to the ground. And many people have crashed and many have died doing that. And then for whatever flaps we have left in still, then we will just raise them incrementally. So if I still have 2 notches of flaps remaining, I'm not taking them both out right now. I'm going to take 1 notch out, continue to climb at VY, because we shouldn't be taking out any flaps if we're at VX. I'm going to climb out at VY. When you take that notch out, you'll feel the plane settle. You'll feel the nose pitch down a little bit. That's okay. We'll get a few more miles per hour or knots in airspeed. I can get that nose back up. And now I'm still safely climbing away, looking at my VVI and my altimeter, showing that I have 2 positive indications of climb. And then we'll go for that last notch of flaps and raise those flaps completely. So those are your go-around procedures. But the big thing is for that, do not raise the flaps all the way up. I flew with someone one time, and we knew we were going to go around, right? We were going to do a low approach at this place. And when I watched them lower the flaps, I noticed they didn't go full flap. They only went half flap. So they went 1 notch, ran some checklist stuff, and then they went another notch. And I think they thought they were at full flaps. I didn't say anything. There's not a need to. It'll be critiquing later, and we'll talk about it later in the debrief. There's no sense while they're busy doing a bunch of other stuff that I throw that out there. And that's kind of my technique. If it's safe, it's not going to kill us, we're not swapping paint with the ground, then I'll let them do it, and we'll talk about it here later as long as it's not unsafe. But I knew what was going to come, right? And what's that? Well, we were going to do a go-around. We were going to do a planned go-around, and our procedure says what? Raise the flaps 1 notch, but that assumes you're at full flaps. So he was going to go from half flaps, he thought he was at full, to only 10 degrees flaps, and that is not near enough flaps to generate extra lift for this slow airspeed. So I knew it was coming, and I'm in the right seat, so guess where my left hand is? It's on my hip, just sitting there, and as soon as he reached for it, I put my hand down so that he could not adjust that flap position. And I said, keep the flaps where they're at. We'll talk about it in a little while. And then we talked about it, and it was a good lesson learned. So the point is, it isn't automatically 1 notch of flaps up. It's you got to have situational awareness on where your flaps are at when you start this go-around. Another great example, a great technique, and some POHs actually specify that in heavy crosswinds, you're not going to land with flaps down. There's just too much side drag, too much stuff hanging out in that crosswind to drag you to the other side of the runway. So a lot of times you'll do a no flap landing. So we'll add 10 miles an hour to all our speeds and then come in, or whatever a POH says you'll add to it. And then all of a sudden you do a go around, and maybe you did half flaps for crosswinds, whatever your POH. All of a sudden you do a go around and bam, you go 1 notch of flaps. Well, that equals no flaps, which is not where you want to be. So you got to make sure that you pay attention to what your initial flap setting was when you initiate that go around. I hope all that makes sense. Now we're going to accelerate, continue our climb, and then start our turn to crosswind. Now, when do we start our turn to crosswind? Well, our aeronautical information manual says we start our turn to crosswind when we're 300 feet away from the traffic pattern altitude, below the traffic pattern altitude. Even though we're climbing out, let's say at VY, which for our Cherokee and Warriors is about 80 miles an hour, we don't necessarily want to start this turn at 80. We want to get a little bit of extra cash in there for mom and the kids. In other words, we want a little bit of a pad here because, again, 80 assumes what? That we've got flaps down, we're wings level, we don't have bank in the aircraft and all that. So when you start, when you have no flaps, and now you got bank angle, now you've got two things that are going to increase your stall speed, then we're going to start a turn which puts G on the aircraft, which increases our stall speed even more. 80 is not a really good place to be for a beginner pilot. Experienced pilot, they've got a feel for the aircraft, they can manage the energy in real time and all that. But if you're new to flying, you need to do this turn at about the same as your base turn. In other words, 10 miles per hour over that final approach speed. And that's a good safety pad. What if there's wind shear out here? What if all of a sudden there's some sort of wind shear and you go from 80 knots or miles per hour down to 70, and you got 1.2 G air on the aircraft, you're in a 35-degree bank angle turned into downwind, and to me, that's still close to the ground, and all of a sudden you lose 10, 20 knots, 50 miles per hour because of wind shear. That airplane's coming down. And by the way, now your left wing is going a few knots slower than the right wing because the left wing is on the inside of the turn. And suppose that's just enough to take it below stall speed. And now what do we have? A spin, and you have no altitude to recover. So the point is, have some airspeed when you do this turn. We're going to start this turn at 300 feet below traffic pattern altitude, and we're looking for traffic ahead of us that we know that was ahead of us in the pattern. We want to make sure that they didn't fly down to Kansas and then start their turn, and then we start our turn on time and end up being a collision factor between them and us. So this 300-foot altitude forces everybody to turn at about the same point. Take this guy in the red here. Maybe he's got a 50 more horsepower in his engine, and he's accelerating to 90 miles an hour. Here we are, with a 160 horsepower Cherokee. Finally, we get to 300 feet below traffic pattern altitude. Finally, we're at 90 miles an hour, and we start our turn. But this hot rod here hits 90 miles an hour and starts his turn before he gets to 300 feet. And guess what we have here? A collision potential, because he starts his turn early. He's lost situational awareness on where I'm at. Maybe he wasn't even paying attention. Or perhaps this is us breaking the rules, and this guy's an ordo, right? Because we have people that can find the traffic pattern without a radio. And then we end up with a collision hazard there because somebody started their turn to crosswind early. That's why we want to hit it at 300 feet, because it standardizes, for the most part, the point above a ground reference, a point above a specific point in the pattern in which people initiate their turn. And for Meadow Lake specific, I guess it's Falcon Highway. That's what Google Earth says. When you get just above Falcon Highway, you're pretty much right about there. You'll be about 300 feet. You'll be at a good airspeed, and you can start your turn. And we're not pulling 9 Gs in this turn, by the way. We got to float this turn around so we continue to hold on to our airspeed, continue to climb, because we want to get to traffic pattern altitude at traffic pattern airspeed, which is 100 miles an hour for this Warrior Cherokee. Beam the departure into the runway ideally. And then we're going to run through all our before landing checks. And then here we are. Now, remember that picture we had earlier when we're entering the traffic pattern? Now we're this guy listening to the radios. We hear that guy at 5 miles entering, his intent to enter entering a 45 downwind for runway 15 at Meadow Lake. We're looking for that individual. And this is why it's important for us to do our part and be at traffic pattern altitude on the established downwind offset as required for winds, of course, so that when he comes in here, or she, they can find us. And remember, a radio is not required. We're going to accelerate to our traffic pattern airspeed, which for these Cherokee Warriors is 100 miles an hour. Typically, it's 20 knots or 100 miles per hour above your final approach speed. Again, refer to your POH. And then we repeat the whole process that we talked about earlier. And when you're ready to leave the pattern, whether it's a low approach or a touch and go, usually you're going to depart at a 45-degree angle and depart the pattern and make your appropriate radio call. We call that a 45-degree departure leg. Again, you got to refer to your chart supplement, see if they dictate what direction or what kind of departure to fly. But all things being equal, you want to do a 45-degree leg away from traffic. We can't do a 45 leg this way to the right. Why is that? Because at Meadow Lake, you've got the grass strip right here. You got to stay away from it. So we do a 45 leg, ideally in the direction that you would normally turn crosswind. And that way we keep all the traffic stuff on one side of the runway, and then depart, make our appropriate radio call, and then climb out as required, keeping that good 10 knots or miles per hour above final approach speed, unless otherwise dictated by your POH. And that's how we depart this traffic pattern. Of course, obviously, this is an uncontrolled field. If we were at a control tower, they would probably be more directive in terms of how they want us to leave the pattern. All right, folks, so that's traffic pattern operations. Again, many, many, many techniques out there. You as a pilot learning, and we should all, I don't care what your experience level is, we should all be learning. We're going to hear 1,000,000 techniques from Bob, 1,000 from Frank, and 45 from Julie, and not all of them apply to me. Not all of them can I picture it in my mind. Not all of them make sense to me, but 3 or 4 over here do. 6 or 7 over here do. 1 or 2 over here make sense, and I'm going to collect those and form my own clue bag that hangs, invisible clue bag hanging on my belt that I'll reach into as required and use those techniques to become a master of the air myself. And then hone those during practice as you go out and fly. And lastly, one thing I'll say, there's this thing out there called chair flying, which means I sit in a chair, my eyes are closed, I'm by myself, I have no distractions, and I'm picturing in my mind's eye where I'm at in the pattern and what I'm doing and what radio calls I'm making, where I'm looking, what I'm thinking, what math I'm doing in my head. Am I doing anything with my instruments to do the halfway down, halfway around, or to compensate for winds? What's my base position? I'm overflying the white building. Now I'm looking for a beam my touchdown point, 10 degrees nose low, power 1800, 1 notch of flaps, and I'm going to slow to 80. All those things you can do without paying for an airplane, without paying for an instructor. You could sit down in a chair and do it. Now, what I'm about to tell you is really dumb, but when I was first learning to fly in a very busy, very fast traffic pattern, me and the rest of my friends that were learning the same thing, we got out on a big parking lot and put down duct tape to mark out the traffic pattern and key positions of the traffic pattern, and we rode our bikes around the thing. Now, I know that sounds like a bunch of geeks, but we became very, very good at it. Very good at it. And it allowed us to anticipate what was next and always be ahead of the aircraft. All right, enough talking on my part. I hope that helped. And if you got any questions, comments, reach out to me, and I'll be more than happy to answer them. Thank you.